gives me great pleasure to introduce Cathy Clarke, who is from the University of Keele, where she is a second-year PhD student, and Cathy's PhD project is the Monastic Houses of Shropshire in the context of their position in the marches. So very relevant to us here. So I'll leave you with Cathy, and you can tell us about it.
Okay, thank you. Okay, firstly, I'd like to say thank you to everybody for coming today, and thank you, Philip, for inviting me to speak here. My project is a comparative study of the major monastic houses of Shropshire in the context of their position on the border, and I'm currently researching the foundation period of the houses, looking particularly at power and patronage. At the moment, I'm going through the process of analysing all the names of the witnesses on the early charters and looking at the relationships between the patrons. My later chapters will examine the economies of the houses, identity, landscape and material culture. So today I've chosen to give you an overview of the foundation period of the houses from the Norman conquest to the end of the 12th century, and I hope it will give you an insight into the period, the people responsible for the foundation of the houses, and how changes in national politics had an impact locally in the march. 50 minutes is actually not actually that long to talk when you've actually got 5 houses to discuss. So forgive me if Shrewsbury Abbey gets a little bit more focused than the others. I'll begin with a short introduction to pre-Domesday Shropshire and Shrewsbury for a little bit of context, along with some background on monasticism in Normandy before moving on to the foundations of each of the houses. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank the members of the Mortimer History Society for contributing to the bursary which I've been awarded this year, and I'm very grateful for this support. Funding research is a real challenge, especially if you're a self-funding researcher, and the bursary will make a huge difference to me. It'll allow me to spend more time with my primary sources, and therefore I should have much better PhD at the end of it. So I'm extremely grateful for that support. So I'll start with Mercia. A picture of Shrewsbury in the county of Shropshire prior to the Norman conquest can be established by examining the information recorded in the Domesday Book and the Geld assessment of the county hidage of the early 11th century. Shrewsbury is recorded in the county hidage as having 100 hides, whilst the county had 2,400. However, the Domesday assessment suggests that by the time of Edward the Confessor's death, nearly 200 of the hides in the west and the south of the county had been laid to waste by Welsh raids. Before the Norman conquest, Shropshire had been part of Mercia, stretching from the Welsh borders to East Anglia and from the River Thames to the rivers Humber and Mersey. For Shrewsbury, the Domesday Book records that before 1066, the burgesses of the town occupied its 252 houses and paid nearly £8 a year in tax. The customs of the town brought the total to £30, of which 2/3 were paid to the king and the remainder to the sheriff. It records that before 1066, Shrewsbury had several churches, with St Chad's and St Mary's being the eldest of the foundations. St Chad's was an episcopal foundation owned by the Bishop of Lichfield, and its parish lay on the southern half of the promontory on which Shrewsbury is situated, with further lands to the south of the River Severn. St Mary's was probably of Middle Saxon origin and lay to the north of the promontory, and was a royal chapel with substantial lands, from which the parishes of the royal foundations of St Alkmund, St Juliana and St Michael were created. By 1086, St Alkmund had 12 canons, and significantly it held 10 hides that comprised the manor of Lilleshall, as well as other lands to the northeast of Shrewsbury. 2 further churches are recorded, St Michael's, adjacent to the castle, and St Peter and St Paul's, which was beyond the town's defences, on land on the opposite bank of the River Severn. St Michael's is likely to have existed before the Norman conquest, being developed to serve the needs of the castle after 1066, with St Peter and St Paul's, later to become Shrewsbury Abbey, being originally founded by Seward, a relative of Edward the Confessor. Domesday also records St Bilberg's Church at Much Wenlock in the Diocese of Hereford. This church was the only monastic house in the county pre-conquest, but by 1066 it was no longer observing a monastic rule and had become a collegiate church. Roger de Montgomery did not arrive in England until December 1067, at which time Orderic Vitalis says that William granted Roger Arundel and Chichester, and only a little later the county of Shropshire. In the early years of William's reign, Roger did not spend much time in England, for if his dealings with Shrewsbury Abbey are excluded, there are only 10 charters signed or witnessed by him in England during the reign of William. Indeed, it was William who defended the royal stronghold at Shrewsbury during the rebellion of 1069, when the men of Chester and their Welsh allies attacked. Roger was most likely in Normandy at that time, ensuring the security of his own lands and those of the duchy for William, following the failure of Norman control in Maine. Roger de Montgomery had been an important member of Duke William's inner circle in Normandy, who from the 1040s frequently appeared as a witness to the Duke's property transactions, having proved his allegiance to the Duke through his military service in campaigns at Domfront and Alencon in 1048 and 1049. He was described by Orderic Vitalis as the Viscount of the Hemois by the time of his marriage to Mabel de Bellême in around 1050, and so was responsible for the protection of the vulnerable southern border between Normandy and Maine. He, like his father before him, established religious houses to underpin their territorial power in the duchy. Orderic Vitalis describes Roger and the other magnates within Duke William's inner circle as men who excelled in judgment and wise counsel. And it was Roger who Duke William entrusted Normandy to when he sailed for England in 1066, leaving him to govern alongside Duchess Matilda and Roger de Beaumont. Prior to 1026, there had only been 6 abbeys in Normandy, all of which were ducal foundations, but by 1070 they'd grown in number to 33. The vast majority of these houses had been established by the aristocracy who, inspired by the piety of their princes, typically populated them with monks from existing Norman houses. They were organised in the same manner as the earlier foundations and were rarely influenced by monastic practice from outside the duchy by monasteries such as Cluny. Originally, monastic houses had been largely confined to the northeast of the duchy, but the expansion after 1030 resulted in monastic colonisation of the southern lands, where the aristocracy granted churches and land. The creation of these foundations could be interpreted as a threat to ducal power, as they could potentially have had divided loyalties, as these abbeys were established during the reign of Robert the Magnificent, at a time of political instability, opposition and rebellion. However, the evidence suggests the reverse. The new foundations supported the ducal monastic reform movement and reinforced the connections that gave the duchy cohesion. Roger de Montgomery had established 3 houses in Normandy before 1066. The Benedictine Abbey of Troarn after 1050, which had been established as a college of secular canons by his father Roger I, sometime after 1034. The Abbey of St Martin de Sèze by 1056, and a nunnery at Elmenèche between 1063 and 1066. Before the Norman conquest, Benedictine monastic houses, nunneries and collegiate churches in the south of England were relatively wealthy and well established. However, in the north, monasticism had been devastated by the Vikings. The houses that had survived were in areas of the country where royal power and control was at its strongest. The church reforms taking place on the continent had yet to be felt in England, where the laity often had possession of churches and their tithes. The Normans who received churches and tithes in the redistribution of property following the conquest soon looked to donate them to the continental monastic houses they patronised. The value of tithes had most likely fallen by this time, and so they gained spiritual advantage whilst losing little income. Donating to existing Benedictine houses was difficult, as many of the monks and abbots had been drawn from the noble families of the defeated English. Roger de Montgomery granted property in Sussex and other locations to his foundations at Sayes, Troarn and Almanesh, but none from his Shropshire estates. Audric describes Roger as a wise and prudent man, a lover of justice, who always enjoyed the company of learned and sober men, a man in the first rank of the nobility. He'd been granted 7/8 of Shropshire by King William, along with estates elsewhere in the country. The size of the grant perhaps in recognition of the challenges that Roger would face in securing the borderlands, as in his continental holdings. Roger had proved to be loyal and effective militarily there, and no doubt William hoped that he would be so again in Shropshire. As tenant-in-chief, Roger had both administrative and feudal control over the county, and soon began to redistribute his lands to his own trusted associates. Audric tells us that Roger gave Warren the Bold his niece in marriage and appointed him to the sheriffdom of Shrewsbury to crush the Welsh and other opponents and pacify the whole province placed under his rule. He says that Roger granted lands to William Pantulf, Pico de Say, Corbett and his sons Roger and Robert, and other brave and loyal men. Of note is the location of their lands on the Powys-Shropshire border, with Warren holding lands north of Shrewsbury, Pico de Say holding land in the hundred of Rinlow and Lentwardine, and Corbett and his sons with a compact group of estates in the south of the county. Of the 230 hides held by the Earl, 196 were held by these three vassals. Roger himself had three main centres of power and administration in the Severn Valley: Shrewsbury, Hen Domin, known as the Old Mound, 2 miles from Montgomery, and the southeast of the county, where by 1086 he had established a new house at Copford. From Montgomery, supported by his vassals that held the border tenancies behind him, Earl Roger was well placed to harry the Welsh. Versions of the Welsh Brute state that he ill-treated the Welsh, and he certainly aimed to control the Welsh of Powys by a steady penetration along the upper valleys of the Dee and Severn. Roger himself held Arwystli at the very centre of Wales, through which ran the main lines of approach to the Welsh coast to Aberystwyth and Cardigan. And once his forces went even further afield, when his Sheriff Warren led a raid into Lynn. As in Normandy, Roger used religious foundations to establish his authority, and between 1079 and 1082, he established a Cluniac priory at the Shropshire Minster Church of Much Wenlock. It has been suggested that this was an attempt by Roger to demonstrate his legitimacy and his commitment to fostering the religious culture he found in a new region by displaying respect for the royal Mercian cult associated with Wenlock. I'll come back to Wenlock a little later. In February 1083, Audric says that Roger announced his plans to construct an abbey at Shrewsbury, one of only 2 Benedictine houses to be founded in the years immediately after the conquest. That he chose to create a new house in the frontier lands of Shropshire rather than in Sussex, where he founded collegiate churches, has been suggested was to provide this new focus of loyalty. Roger had been persuaded to found the house by Odelirius, father of Audric Vitalis and one of Roger's 3 clerks, who Audric describes as a man of remarkable intelligence, eloquence, and learning. He writes that the new abbey of St. Peter and St. Paul was to be erected at the East Gate, where the Meal joins the Severn, on the site of an existing wooden chapel built by Seward. Seward had submitted to William and as a result had managed to maintain the control of some of his lands and had surrendered the site of the abbey in return for the manor of Cheney Longville, a manor he'd held before the conquest. Odelirius had been given the chapel and the house next to it by Roger. On a visit to Rome, he had vowed to replace the wooden structure with a stone church. He had pledged £15 towards the building of the monastery, and himself and his 5-year-old son Benedict once it was constructed. Orderic was already under the tutelage of Seward's priest from the chapel and had been accepted for entry into Roger's house at St. Evroe. Orderic states that on the 25th of February 1083, Roger gave the whole suburb situated outside the east gate to the monastery and laid his gloves on the altar of the chapel as a symbol of his gift and intention. That same year, 2 monks, Reginald and Frodo, arrived from Serres to assist O'Delirius and Warren in the construction of the monastery, with the first abbot, Fulcrid, joining the house in late 1087. I'm very fortunate that the cartularies of Shrewsbury, Ormond and Lilleshall have been transcribed by Una Rees. However, as a researcher, you do still need to access and use the original manuscripts as much other information is lost in a printed version. In the case of Shrewsbury's cartulary, although I've worked with it, it is a restricted item, and so unfortunately I don't have any photos that I'm allowed to share with you today. And just in case any of you are unfamiliar with the term cartulary, it's simply a term used to refer to a series of charters, documents, and sometimes even chronicles that have been transcribed and bound together in a book. They're sometimes known as registers. None of the earliest charters of the Abbey survive in their original form until the Confirmation Charter of Henry II of 1155. But the early charters outlining the gifts to the monastery are recorded in the Cartulary of Shrewsbury Abbey, which was compiled sometime between 1278 and 1292, with a few later additions. Owing to the analysis of the Cartulary by Una Rees, it's possible to be fairly confident about the first patrons to the Abbey and the gifts that they made to it. According to Henry I's Confirmation Charter of 1121, Earl Roger's initial endowment in 1083 included the rents of 3 mills and 39 burgesses, 3 manors and 7 churches. Warren the Bold donated Tugford and 2 more churches, whilst Reynold gave Lee and Ellesmere, Elcher gave Monks Albrighton, and Roger de Lacy gave Montford. Elcher was a subtenant of Earl Roger, holding 4 further manors from Reynold and 1 manor directly from the Earl, and he was not listed as a pre-conquest tenant in Domesday. He may well have been an Englishman who profited from the new Norman regime, acting as a deputy sheriff, first for Warren, then Reynold. Roger de Lacy was another subtenant of the Earl, but his major landholdings were in Herefordshire, not Shropshire, where he held significant lands directly from the king. So by 1086, the Abbey lands were valued by Domesday at £34, 4 shillings and 8 pence, plus another £12 from the mills and burgesses of Shrewsbury, and the income from the churches it possessed. Rees argues that this endowment, whilst not lavish, compared well with that of Chester at just over £13. The death of William the Conqueror during this period created a conflict of loyalty for many of the Anglo-Norman barons. In 1088, the Earl rebelled against William Rufus, the new king, as did some of his sons, having been persuaded by Rufus's uncle, Odo of Bayeux, and Robert de Mortain, to join them in support of Duke Robert's claim to the throne. Roger waited at his castle in Arundel for Duke Robert's arrival, whilst his vassals joined with Ralph de Mortimer and others to attack Worcester. His son, Robert de Bellême, joined the siege at Rochester Castle. The plot soon collapsed, and Roger returned to the king's side before the Duke had even set sail from Normandy. Robert de Bellême was arrested and imprisoned on his return to Normandy with the future King Henry I by Duke Robert, forcing Robert de Montgomery to travel to Normandy with the king's permission to defend his castles. In this turbulent time, and with a new king on the throne, the monks of Shrewsbury Abbey sought to secure their possessions by seeking a confirmation charter from William Rufus. Warren the Bold died sometime after March 1085, and after his death, his widow granted the abbey a house in Shrewsbury that had been part of her dowry for the soul of her husband. She married Reynold de Balliol, who succeeded to Warren's honour, and he and Warren's son Hugh donated the tithes of Littleness and Shawwoodine and the churches of Middle and Oswestry. Reynold's holdings of Earl Roger were only exceeded by Robert Fitz-Tetbold. Can never say that name. Robert Fitz-Tetbold, Roger's sheriff in the honour of Arundel, who granted the tithes of Kemberton and the church and tithes of Isle to the abbey before his death in 1087. According to King Stephen's charter, between 1086 and his death in 1094, Roger gave 6 further churches from his manors, and his vassals and close associates added a further 11.5 hides of land. To these donations can be added the grants made at his burial, bringing the abbey's annual income to over £50. This early group of benefactors were Roger's vassals from his estates in Normandy and can be identified as continental landholders and witnesses to charters in both England and Normandy. The Corbett family and the family of Pico de Say had made donations to Roger's foundation at St Martin de Ses, as had, is that name again, Robert Fitz-Tetbold's family, the Avoirs. Robert Fitz-Tetbold, Pico de Say, Reynold de Balliol and William Pantulf all held lands on the continent, while benefactors such as Helgo de Ferches, Gerard de Tournay, Robert Fitz-Corbett and Roger Fitz-Corbett and Odo de Bernier can all be traced to continental families. The origins of Warren the Bold are more difficult to identify, but it's been suggested that he may well be the Warren that witnessed 2 charters between Roger and the Bishop of Ses in 1070. If so, he too was a man of considerable rank in Normandy before his arrival in Shropshire. Gilbert de Salneville came from lands granted to Troarn by Roger, and is likely to be Gilbert the Constable that witnessed a 1085 land grant alongside Warren. At Roger's death, his son Hugh became Earl of Shrewsbury, freeing the abbey from secular service and granting them rights in the shire, which was recorded in his Charter of the Liberties, and another of the Earl's sons, Roger de Poitou, donated lands in Lancashire. Hugh also rebelled against William Rufus, although the detail here is poor. Orderic claims that Hugh and Roger de Lacy had taken part in the 1095 rebellion of Robert de Mowbray, Earl of Northumbria, and were punished for their part in it, their only common interest being their positions as border lords. Hugh was killed in July 1098 in Anglesey, campaigning against the Welsh with Hugh, Earl of Chester, when they were defeated by the forces of Magnus of Norway, who had allied with the Welsh against the Anglo-Normans. Now Earl Robert de Balem gave Baschurch sometime between 1098 and his fall. Robert de Balem had at times been a supporter of Robert Curthose, William Rufus and Henry, on occasion allying with 2 of the brothers against the third. His positive relationship with Henry, however, had come to an end by 1092, when the Earl lost control of the castle at Domfront when it was seized by Henry. After Henry's accession in 1100, Balem and his brother Roger de Poitou accepted Henry as the new king, despite Henry's retention of Domfront, but the Earl would not be invited into the king's inner circle. This accord would not last long, and Balem was named as one of 3 powerful magnates behind the failed invasion of Duke Robert in July the following year. Henry would bide his time gathering a case against the Earl before summoning him and his brothers to court to answer for 45 charges, including the unauthorised fortification of the castle at Bridgenorth. Robert fled the court, escaping to his castle at Shrewsbury and refusing to answer any further summons. The king marched on Shrewsbury with a huge army, where Robert and his brothers surrendered, and they were forced to leave the country, forfeiting their English lands. With the rebellion of Earl Robert, the abbey lost the protection of its most prominent patron. However, many of the abbey's early donors, men chosen by Roger Montgomery for their experience and proven experience in the borderland, retained their estates. It's likely that Henry could not afford to lose them, as their support was vital to maintaining control in the borderlands. Men like Pico de Say, Roger Fitzcorbett, and Hugh, son of Warren the Bold, remained powerful men in the county, only now holding their lands as tenants-in-chief directly from the king. The abbey would receive few substantial donations after this time, but those that were made continued to come from the Norman associates of the Earls of Shrewsbury that had survived the rebellion. Henry I showed his support to the abbey with a grant of timber from the Royal Forest for building in 1105 and confirmed its freedoms from tolls granted by his brother William Rufus. He also granted it a 3-day fair, but he did not grant a general charter of confirmation until 1121. With no earl, the county was placed in the hands of Richard de Balme, Bishop of London, who as steward became responsible for its administration and became the new defender of the abbey. The bishop appears as a signatory on many of the early charters and is described by Orderic as viceroy of the county. His role in defending the abbey is most clearly seen in the testimonium of Walter the Constable, compiled between May 1121 and 1126. This charter deals with a series of disputes over the rights of the abbey that arose after 1102, when the protection of the Montgomery family ended. One of the witnesses to this charter was Alan Fitz-Flad, who had received the honour of Warren the Bold after Warren's son Hugh had died. Alan Fitz-Flad was a Breton favoured by Henry I, and he ranked only to the bishop in the county. The abolition of the earldom of Shrewsbury and the arrival of Henry I's new men signalled a change to bonds of loyalty and allegiance in Shropshire. No longer bound to the earl, they were free to promote their own interests and ambitions, and this was reflected in a change of monastic patronage. Henry's new men in the county wished to make their own mark and chose to support and establish new foundations. The earliest foundations of Ormond Abbey are difficult to establish, but a 13th century chronicle, which may well have been written at Ormond, claims a date of 1110. It was founded on land that formed part of the fee of Alan Fitz-Flad, but in the cartulary of Ormond Abbey, an entry made at least 72 years after its foundation claims it was founded by William Fitzalan in 1100, which is not possible. With no charter that declares the Fitzalans gifted the original site to the abbey, it's possible that Alan and his wife had supported a small eremitical community at Ormond before it was later developed as a priory and an abbey by their descendants. The abbey was populated by Augustinian canons, who were possibly introduced to England as early as 1108 by Bishop Balme. These canons were popular with Henry I and his wife Matilda, and as such, their patronage by families like the Fitzalans was to be expected. Early grants to the abbey include the grant of a fishery at Upton and the lands attached to it by William Fitzalan between 1125 and 1136. This charter was witnessed by Walter Fitzalan, brother of William, and William's wife Christiana. Christiana was a niece of Robert, Duke of Gloucester, Empress Matilda's half-brother. It's likely that the Church of Trefiglois was another early donation, although no early charter survives. The church there may have been established by a monk called Bletherus, who is said to have requested land from Madog, king of Powys. This extensive grant was made between 1132 and 1141. The lands, not the church, are recorded as being granted to Ormond by Howell, King of Arwistli, in a later charter of 1157. Along with the church at Trefeglois, the gift of Shawbury Church to Ormond is later recorded in a charter, but two of Bishop Chester's charter from the same period suggest an earlier link with Ormond. At around this time, William Fitzalan witnessed Bishop Clinton of Chester's foundation charter for Buildwas Abbey, and again, I'll come back to Buildwas later. It can get a little confusing at times, for although Roger de Clinton is referred to as the Bishop of Chester, his diocese was that of Lichfield. For example, after Roger himself died on crusade in 1148, his successor was referred to as the Bishop of Coventry. The diocese was huge at this point in time, and it simply depended on where the current bishop had its seat. Chester was wealthier, Lichfield was unwalled, but Coventry was well protected. With his marriage to Christiana, William's loyalties lay with the Empress, and when Duke Robert of Gloucester rebelled against the king in 1138, William held the town and castle of Shrewsbury against royal forces for a month before fleeing with his family to Chester. William's land was forfeited to the king during Stephen's reign, and his foundation at Ormond was forced to rely on the support and protection of others. William's loyalty to the Empress was repaid with her grants to Ormond in the summer of 1141 of land and a mill. One of the many signatories to this charter was Archdeacon Richard de Belmay II. Richard was the nephew of Bishop Richard de Belmay I, who had died in 1127, and made his nephews Richard and Philip his heirs. And we will hear more about them shortly in connection with Lilleshall. William Fitzalan's protector, the Earl of Chester, helped ensure Ormond's growth with the gift of a boat on the Dee and quittance of all tolls on 6,000 herrings per annum. His ally, Cadwallader ap Griffith, who supported Earl Ranulph at the Battle of Lincoln, gave a church at Nevin. Other supporters of Matilda also gave donations. Despite the loss of his Shropshire lands, William had been able to cultivate sufficient support for his foundation from the followers of the Empress that Ormond had been able to develop from a priory to an abbey between the years 1135 and 1155, enabling a much larger church to begin construction. Henry, as Duke of Normandy and Aquitaine and Earl of Anjou, confirmed his mother's charter at Leicester in 1153, and with William Fitzalan as a witness. Once Henry was king, William's lands were restored to him, and in 1155, William granted the Church of Wroxeter to Ormond so that the abbot might have full convent. As king, Henry confirmed the gift of land and the mill at Walcott again, and importantly confirmed the abbey's possession of the site and the 60 acres of land that they had asserted in what was royal forest. As with the Earls of Shrewsbury at their foundation, the vassals and extended family of William displayed their loyalty through their donations. When William passed away at Easter 1160, leaving his young son William Fitzalan II in the care of his mother, William's second wife, Isabel de Say, Baroness of Clun. At the request of Ulred, the abbot of Ormond, King Henry II granted the young heir custody of the abbey during vacancies. In 1172, the abbot also requested a papal bull to secure the donations from the supporters of the Fitzalans that had continued after William's death. As William Fitzalan II was in his minority and unable to protect their rights and privileges. During the foundation period of Ormond Abbey, Bishop Roger de Clinton had founded Buildwas Abbey on land that had been held by the bishops of Chester since before 1066. It was founded as an affiliate house of the Abbey of Savigny. King Stephen had founded a Savignac house at Furness in Lancashire in 1126 or 1127 and was patron of the Mother House. The foundation date of 1135 comes from a poor transcript of an earlier charter, and amongst the witnesses present were William Fitzalan, who granted Little Buildwas, Philip de Belmay, and Robert of Gloucester, whilst the original grant by William Fitzalan I of Little Buildwas from his manor in Wroxeter is not extant. A confirmation charter of his son from around 1175 confirms his gift to the abbey. By the time of King Stephen's confirmation charter, just 3 years later at the siege of Shrewsbury, William Fitzalan had been banished from the county, and Robert of Gloucester had sided with Matilda against Stephen. King Stephen's charter confirms the hidage given in Doomsday and exempted the abbey from all obligations and dues, and refers to the abbey as dedicated to St. Chad. Some of the witnesses to this charter were also early donors, with Philip de Belmay granting Ruckley in the manor of Tong in 1139, with a house now further dedicated to St. Mary in the fashion of the Cistercians, whilst remaining a Savignac house. Philip would not make further donations to Buildwas, but would instead found Lilleshall Abbey with his brother. This may well have upset Bishop Roger, as we shall see. In 1147, the General Chapter admitted the Savignac houses into the Cistercian order, and in 1156, St Mary's Dublin was committed to Abbot Ranulph of Buildwas, as was Basingwork in 1157. A bull of Anastasius IV from 1154 lists the Savignac houses of Basingwork and St Mary's Dublin as filiations of Cumbermere, and Buildwas's new authority over these houses would be challenged for many years to come. But each time the General Chapter at Citeaux would uphold the arrangements. Whilst there's no extant cartulary for Buildwas, some documents do remain, plus a fair quantity of books from its library, and these books will form part of my research for my later chapters. Although Philip de Belmay had been a patron of the Sauvignac Buildwas Abbey, when it came to founding a house, he and his brother chose to populate their foundation at Lilleshall with Augustinian canons. If you recall, their uncle, the bishop, had helped introduce the regular canons to England. The brothers chose to populate their house with the more austere Augustinian canons from the abbey at Arroways that had been introduced to England by Alexander, Bishop of Lincoln. The original site of the abbey was on land between Watling Street and Lizard Grange, granted by Philip de Belmay around 1144. Philip had also granted the canons the churches at Ashby and Blackfordby, along with other land and tithes in Leicestershire. The wording of his charter implied the canons were already living on the site, but it did not make the location clear. Archbishop Theobald's charter says the canons were building on land in Lilleshall Wood. It's therefore clear that very soon after the first grants were made, the house had moved site to its permanent location at Lilleshall. At the same time as Philip's donation, his brother Richard gave his rights in the Church of St Alkmund in Shrewsbury. These rights had been transferred to him by Henry I soon after his uncle's death in 1127. At the time of Doomsday, the Collegiate Church of St Alkmund's had significant holdings in the county, including land at Lilleshall. This consisted of 21 burgesses, 12 canons' houses, and significant land in the county. Richard's donation included Lilleshall and Attingham, with the other prebends to follow as they became vacant. However, two of St Alkmund's possessions were in secular hands by the time of Doomsday, with Wistonstow being held by Nigel the Doctor from the King, and Khartoum being held wrongly by Pico. The abbey would pursue its rights to the prebends of Wistonstow, but there is no evidence that they ever did so in the case of Khartoum and Pico de Say. St Alkmund's, the church, was a royal foundation, and the suppression of its secular canons and the donation of its prebends to Lilleshall Abbey necessitated obtaining the support and permission of both king and pope. The first royal confirmation charter was that of King Stephen in 1145, with the pattern of confirmations by Matilda in 1148 and Henry as Duke of Normandy and later king. Given the large transfer of church lands to the abbey, the consent of Bishop de Clinton as the diocesan bishop would have been expected, but he does not appear to have given it. It would be speculation to question why he did not, possibly because he'd recently founded his own house at Buildwas. But after Bishop Alexander of Lincoln, the great supporter of the Arrowaysian canons, visited Pope Eugenius III in Rome in 1145, a man with whom he was in high favour, Bishop Clinton appears to have had a change of heart. However, this only came after Pope Eugenius issued an order for him to do so. Richard himself would later be promoted to the See of London, like his uncle, in 1152, and would be a witness to Henry II's charter to Lilleshall in 1155, along with Alexander of Lincoln. He would do little for his own cathedral of St Paul's, however, and during his office focused all his efforts instead on Lilleshall. The Lilleshall canons after 1166 compiled a history of St Alkmund's Church, detailing their rights of ownership over the prebend of Wistonstow, which had been disputed. I include this dispute in a little bit more detail. It's typical of the kind of challenges that the Houses of Shropshire had to negotiate during politically turbulent times. This document records how Earl Hugh asked the canons of St Alkmund's to grant Winstonstow to Gilbert de Cundor for 3 or 4 years, during which time Gilbert would pay the church 10 shillings per annum and afterwards return the prebend to the church. This was because Gilbert had promised to raise help for the Earl in his fight against the Welsh, and that he would restore Winstonstow, which had currently laid to waste, to its former state. After Hugh's death, the new Earl, Robert, allowed Gilbert to forcibly occupy the prebend. They claim in the history that they appealed to the sheriff, and that the aforesaid Gilbert and his knights had stripes and discipline administered to them in the church of St Martin, and then Gilbert was led naked to St Alkmund's church, and there he offered up the prebend on the altar. The canons allowed Gilbert to retain the lands for his lifetime for the payments of 10 shillings a year, but the history says that on the death of the sheriff, they took back their lands, only for the Earl of Hereford to occupy it by force. He granted it to Elias de Say, Lord of Clun, in exchange for 30 marks, who in turn granted it to Baldwin de Stapleton for 1 night's service, his son Philip then inheriting it. Before 1188, the canons of Lilleshall had begun their efforts again to recover the prebend, but they never recovered it to its full extent. The canons would have many such issues, with their scattered estates being difficult and expensive to administer, with the additional expense imposed upon them due to its status as a royal house. Throughout this period, Wenlock Priory had continued to develop following its refoundation by Roger de Montgomery. It retained the vast majority of its pre-conquest lands, only losing a couple of manors which were later either returned or replaced with an alternative. There exists a transcript of a charter that describes the foundation of the priory by the Earl. The charter, which can be dated between 1087 and 1094, states that after restoring the church of St Milburg, Earl Roger granted it to the house of La Charité-sur-Loire in return for an annual rent of 100 shillings. Wenlock was a Cluniac house and had been populated with monks from the mother house. Soon after their arrival, the monks discovered the bones of St Milburga while repairing the nearby ruined church of Holy Trinity. Various versions of her discovery exist. In one popular account, St Milburga's remains were discovered when 2 children fell into her grave during repairs to the church, whilst another claims that the monks were encouraged to dig in the appropriate place by Anselm, Archbishop of Canterbury. That St Milburga had allowed herself to be discovered by the newly arrived Cluniac monks and then began to perform miracles showed the local people that the saint was happy with their new community, and therefore her patron, Earl Roger, allowing the foundation to flourish. At the downfall of Robert de Bellême, the rights and patronage previously enjoyed by the Earls reverted to the Crown, but because of Cluniac privileges, this amounted only to hospitality and prayers. Other nobility and royalty would continue to support the house, and Bishop Richard de Balme would be a protector of this house too. Between 1107 and 1115, he issued a charter stating the land of St Milburg's is all one parish and subject to the mother church. In 1163, when the priory at Paisley was founded by Walter FitzAlan, brother of William, who was in the service of King David of Scotland, the prior of Wenlock sent monks to populate it and allowed the prior to be chosen from amongst them. The FitzAlan interests continued with Isabel de Say, wife of William FitzAlan I, making a further grant for the soul of her husband, and William FitzAlan II witnessing the charter of King Richard I at Roche Abbey in 1198, which created the liberties of Wenlock. This removed its manors from the hundreds of Munslow, Condover and Brimstree, and the 100 courts and the court of the county. Furthermore, the priory held exemption from the regard and view in all its woods, giving it the most extensive ecclesiastical immunity in the county. However, its most prosperous time would not come until the following century. Wenlock, like Buildwas, does not have a cartulary, although some fragments of it remain. There are, however, many other documents relating to it which require a great deal more research. Although I've alluded to some elements of competition and rivalry between the patrons of the houses, in my thesis I will further develop the relationships between the houses themselves. However, it's worth pointing out that all the houses were important to the county and its great families, and this is best illustrated by the presence of the abbots of Lilleshall, Ormond, Buildwas and the Prior of Wenlock, along with the Archdeacon of Shropshire at the deathbed of William Fitzalan I in 1160 and his choice of burial in Shrewsbury Abbey. I still have many more manuscripts, charters and documents to examine in archives and a great deal more research to carry out. But I hope by the end of my project, we'll have a greater understanding of the monastic houses of Shropshire in the context of their position of the borderlands of England and Wales. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Cathy, for navigating our way through that. The complexities of the power and the patronage of abbeys in Shropshire. We are very blessed to have so many.
Not least the pronunciation of all the names.
You did so well.
Sorry.
You did so well. No, it's grand. Any questions? Anyone?
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for an illuminating talk. You were very focused on, obviously, in Shrewsbury Abbey itself and for the other 4 foundations. I declare an interest in Cherbury. Is this going to be is this going to feature or in your thesis or not?
Cherbury?
Yes.
Very much at the moment, my focus is on the houses themselves and who was donating what and when and who was witnessing these things. So I can establish the interconnections between the families in Shropshire itself and some that are actually from out of area. After that, I may look in more detail at some of the individual donations, but at the moment, it's still very much at that stage where I'm looking at the names of people that are involved. I think when I get onto the chapters on the economies, I will very much be then looking more in the manners and finding out what's gone on in more detail, and maybe it might even form part of a case study, for example, but not specifically at the moment.
Watch this space. Thank you very much.
Yeah. That's good.
Okay. Okay, well, thanks again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.